Nick Smith here, speaking to you from London. Welcome to the 11th in our series of Alpine Club casts. Tonight, we're celebrating mountaineering artists past and present. I really hope you enjoy it. If you're watching live on YouTube, please add any questions to the chat there as we go along, and we'll try to get those answered at the end. And as usual, anyone watching on Zoom, you will be unmuted at the end, and do stick around for any applause and a chat. First tonight, we have William Mitchell with us. An art dealer, climber and writer, William has written the first book in English about Loppé. As a prolific artist and mountaineer who often climbed with former Alpine Club president Leslie Stephen, Gabriel Loppé, who was born in 1825, was the first painter to have depicted what the French call la haute montagne. When we're finally allowed back to the Alpine Club at Charlotte Road, you can see a number of his paintings on show next to the bar. William's here to tell us more. Over to you, William.
Good evening. I'm absolutely delighted to be here to talk to you about Gabriel Loppé. And as Nick said, he was a man of many firsts, but I think he was the first painter that we could really describe as a peintre alpiniste. Here he is. This is what he looked like. He was, I should state now, he was a painter rather than a climber, but he was a very prolific painter and he was a very prolific climber. He climbed he climbed Mont Blanc over 30 times in his life. He painted from the summit 11 times in his life. And Gabriel Loppé had a charmed life, but in a way he had a unique relationship with the Alpine Club. And it was the Alpine Club where he became famous. And that's why I want to talk to you about him. It was the Alpine Club who helped us identify Loppé when I first found the picture in the mid-90s. And little did I know that we'd really stumbled across what we now call the Canaletto of the Alps, which is what he was called in his time. And in 1998, there was a major exhibition in Grenoble, and the curator wrote at the end of the catalogue about Loppé. He said, "This is an artist who remains to be discovered." And I'm here to tell you a little bit about him. So thank you, Nick. We're going to look at this slide here. This is 1858, and this is 2 o'clock in the morning. Loppé got up and he went up Le Brevant and he painted Donati's Comet. And Donati's Comet came to Europe and was visible from Europe, and the night skies in the summer of 1858 was the brightest thing anybody had ever seen. And to me, it was a one-off event, and it sums up Loppé. He was a one-off. He came. There was nobody had been like him before, and I think this painting, why it fascinated him, it shows Loppé's curiosity. And really, it's kind of what made me write a book about Loppé. It was this extraordinary curiosity he had in his surroundings and the time he lived in as well. And when we look at this was painted in 1861 on the summit of Mont Blanc. This is the first time anyone had, I think, in any art form, the photography expedition by the Bisson brothers failed. And this was Loppé who went with them. He bluffed his way onto the trip saying, "I can show you the way up." He had never climbed Mont Blanc because it was simply too expensive. When he was on the top, he painted this sketch, and it was one of a series of sketches he would make on the summit. There's another one, which is in the summer of 1867. This is Mont Blanc de Courmayeur looking the other way. You can see he's written sur le Mont Blanc. He's very proud of the fact that he worked and he did the whole thing up there. And this was a facet of Loppé that was unique at the time, and which is why he deserves such praise. How it is that Joubert could then write and say that this was an artist who was forgotten about in the 90s, it was very true. And I think when we look through, if we go to the next picture, this very famous picture in Charlotte Road, we get an idea of what this was about. This was a man who came across mountaineering by chance in the mid-1840s. And I think the key to really understanding Loppé is these three figures here. This is dawn looking at the Grand Jurasse, and these figures were simply a representation of the company that he climbed Mont Blanc with. And I think it's essential to remember that Loppé's life was about friendship and companionship. If you go to the next photograph, there's Mont Blanc from Grand Combin Dawn. Again, it's important. The group of climbers I think they've been up the summit or they're waiting for him. And this was a story that was very played out many times, that the guides would get absolutely sick and tired of waiting to him for finished paintings. This is a large painting, which belongs to a family in Chamonix. And he wouldn't have done this on the summit, but the sketches that he did would have been worked up to produce this picture. It's beautiful. It has every color you can possibly imagine. Any painting restorer who's confronted a Loppé can never understand these colors that he mixed. He was self-taught. And if we move to the next painting, you can see that the working from life, what's called en plein air in French, this is in everything that Loppé tried to do outside was always dated. You can see it's the 11th of February in 1896. In his diaries, he recorded that it was -18. You can't paint with gloves on. And I think I'll leave that thought with you, that this is his hometown. And if we go to the next photograph, we see him at the Grand Moulet hut with his extraordinary deerstalker hat on. There he is sketching with his friends. But at Loppé, I maintained this theme of friendship in his life. His guides were his friends. And this man who was such an important part of his life was Leslie Stephen, who was instrumental in getting Loppé to become an honorary member of the Alpine Club, and a foreigner, of course, one of the very first members to be elected as honorary and foreign member. And Loppé owed it to the Alpine Club in many ways, but for 40 years he exhibited his paintings. So as we go on to the next picture, we see this is really, historically we refer to Canaletto, but this is the Grand Canal of Chamonix. This was what he specialized in, his crevasses. And he understood the colors from first-hand experience. This was painted on the spot. Now, one of the questions I'm asked a lot, and I'm going to clarify this now, is that Loppé was very proud of the fact that he painted almost all of the pictures that were practically able to paint, as in physically format size. I have one right here, actually. This is on a cigar box. I hope you can see it. It's the Mer de Glace, 1877. He pulled it out. He would have sat painting it. And I think it's important to remember Loppé reacted to the motif from life. He was in front of this when he painted it. You can see in the distance some climbers making their way across. There's the Dent de Gé on the left. So today we go up to the Torino hut on the right. But he understood the colors of ice. And it really was, if you said, what did Loppé paint? To the absolute, he excelled at painting snow and ice. So if we go on, this is coming down off Mont Blanc and towards the Grand Moulet hut. And you see in the foreground these crevasses there. They're like slits in the ice that he's put this enormous sense of depth in them and color. And again, that green in the distance over beyond the Aiguille Rouge, you can see it's an unbelievably complicated color. And I think in a way, a bit like Coca-Cola, the format was very secretive. Loppé was very, he furtively kept his paints and his colors because he really understood. He'd mixed a magic formula. You can see Chamonix down in the valley. And when we go on to see this iconic picture in Chamonix, this is actually me standing in front of one of Loppé's what we call monster canvases. This was painted in 1874. And it's hard to imagine that by this time, Loppé had become independently wealthy through his work and through his second marriage. And he had money, which meant he could experiment. And he did these enormous 4-meter canvases. That's without the frame, which is 70 centimeters itself wide. And so Loppé would take this off its stretcher. He made these balsa wood tubes. He painstakingly rolled them up, sent it to Marseille from Chamonix, and the road had only been built for the last 10 years. And these were exhibited in London in the Conduit Street Gallery in Mayfair. And I think you can imagine what it's like standing in front of it today. It's exciting, but imagine seeing that with those little climbers coming up the side there. People would have been absolutely fascinated by it. And these pictures weren't for sale. You didn't possibly imagine anyone had space for a 18-foot painting. But he was an ambassador for the Alps. And I want to say, as we come to the end of this talk, that what he did do, Loppé, is he loved mountains. Loppé was neither a mystic, he was neither a prophet, and he didn't write any poems or any fancy things about the Alps. But I think his friendship with Leslie Stephen was important, because if we go on, again, look at the two guys standing at the bottom right, looking up at the Matterhorn. They're having a chat. And Loppé, I mentioned earlier, was ambitious, but he followed the money. When the attention went from Chamonix to Zermatt in the late 1860s, he was in Zermatt a lot. He fell in love with the place. I think his heart remained where his home was in Chamonix, but he was very, very fond of Zermatt. And this is a fantastic painting in the Kunstmuseum in Bern. It's often reproduced. And if we go on, you feel again the theme of Zermatt is here. And he climbed the Breithorn. One early morning, this was a picture that he'd worked up from a sketch. Now there's the Mont Blanc in the distance. It's topographically precise, very precise. And if we go on to the next slide, we'll get an idea of why he did this. The buyer of this picture was an Alpine Club member in the 1880s. And I think he said to Loppé in an exhibition, "Monsieur Loppé, I don't really believe these are all these peaks. Do you know them?" So Loppé grabbed a piece of paper, and this is a price list from the exhibition. And he had a terrible temper on him as well, Loppé. He was méridional from Montpellier, and he was proud of the fact he had periodically some bad blow-ups. Anyway, he wrote on this piece of paper every mountain, and you can see them all, and I'm not going to list them, but it's beautiful how even this is a work of art. And this shows that he was up there and he knew exactly what he was painting, but this was not done on the summit because he did oil sketches. He was not an ink drawer on summits at all. This was done at the exhibition with a key, and I think the buyer very cleverly taped it to the back of the picture. So when we found the picture, it was exciting to open the back and find this. On the next slide, we're going to look at a lovely winter trip he made with Leslie Stephen in the 1870s. They went off together to the Bernese Oberland, and they walked in the winter from Meiringen all the way to Lauterbrunnen and then back to Haslital. And they were very intrepid because it wasn't all plain sailing. The weather was freezing. They had big snow drifts, but they stayed in villages, and it was a very special time in Loppé's life. And they enjoyed each other's company enormously. This is walking in Hasliberg, and you see the better one. Again, I think if we go to the next slide, we get an idea of this picture. This little sketch, which again, I show you. This is dated, you see, 21st of August, 1877. It's important because it shows that he would break off from his trips and sit and sketch this. And it's very rapidly done, but very precise. He knew these profiles, the Grand Charmeuse d'Andegem. He knew it all very, very carefully. But equally, he was careful to put in his figures to give you a sense of scale. And if we go on now, we'll get to the end of the talk, whereas Loppé loved sunsets. This is Montagne de la Côte. This is a sunset. Again, this is oil on paper. This is painted up at well over 3,500 meters, but he's pulled it out in the evening on his way to the Grand Moulin hut, and he's done this sketch. And you can feel the burning sun behind the clouds, but it's very atmospheric. In the next photograph, you'll see London, where this is the same room that Monet painted from. And I think that the Impressionists eclipsed all art in the 19th century was eclipsed by the Impressionists, which is one of the reasons Loppé disappeared from the public eye, because these people really came across. They were not fashionable in their time, but as we know, in the 1920s, they took off. So Loppé, in a way, was doing Monet. The two of them would never have known each other. They would have had nothing to have spoken about. Loppé enjoyed staying at the Savoy because he had the money to stay there. And we're going to finish with the most exciting painting probably that has ever come to light in recent years. This was the Alpine Club owns the sunset on the Mont Blanc, 1873, 6th of August, looking the other way. It's a wonderful snow cone sunset picture, but this was a lost picture. And there's a whole chapter in the Playground of Europe dedicated to this. And this was when he and Leslie Stephen climbed to the top of Mont Blanc. And as they were there, Loppé insisted on painting the sunset. And as they were there, the shadow of Mont Blanc cast this enormous trail across the sky. And you can see the moon is out. And there's one key to anyone who would ever challenge and say, Loppé, you didn't really paint that sitting on the summit. Now, I'm going to repeat, he didn't have any gloves on because you cannot paint with gloves. And he didn't have his iPhone. So what he did have is the ability to paint quickly. This was 7:30 at night. You can imagine how hard the snow was getting, how dangerous it was, and how fed up these guides were. And you see them, he's put them together on their own, and I think that's Leslie Stephen on the left. The reason I know this was done on the spot, because Loppé he would never have trusted himself to have gone down and done it. And we know that at the top of the Mont Blanc, there are no shadows because the Mont Blanc is already in nighttime. Therefore, a painter who'd put shadows by these little figures would have given the game away that it wasn't painted there. This is done entirely on the summit. The long brushstroke of the summit that goes from left to right is the clue. He painted it very quickly. There's the Weisshorn and the Matterhorn in the background. And to finish this talk, this is one of the reasons that Loppé really dropped away from the public eye. He loved photography. Like many painters, he was fascinated by it all through his life. He had a go at it in the 50s. He gave it up. He smashed his camera in a fit of rage, which was very expensive, so he had to buy a new one. And by the 1880s, he was a very good photographer. The Musée d'Orsay owned this famous photograph. They own 300 paintings 300 photographs by Loppé, but they don't own any paintings. And when I approached them about this, borrowing this image of this photograph, it seemed completely unknown to them that he's a painter. He took this in summer of 1902, and in a way, it was done just for his own pleasure. A friend of his sent it to Monsieur Eiffel, and Monsieur Eiffel I've often compared him to the Richard Branson of his time. He was a showman. He was a hugely wealthy man from this wretched tower that they wanted to pull down. And the photograph became an overnight hit, and Loppé became a famous photographer, and Eiffel pulled as many strings as he could, made Loppé a member of all these different photo clubs, and he went down as Loppé, a photographer as well as a painter. And it was only the Alpine Club that held on to his memory as a wonderful artist. And this is a quirk of history, but it's important to remember this is how artists can get forgotten. So I hope I've given you a breath of life back into him, and you'd be in very good company with Jon and Ben tonight. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to you, Nick.
Thank you, William. Wonderful. Really enjoyed that. Wonderful pictures. So next tonight, two living artists. Firstly, Jon Coulton. Jon tells me he discovered the wild places of Yorkshire and a love of drawing at an early age. And by the time he was 20, this had developed into serious mountaineering and painting combined. Jon previously exhibited at the Alpine Club in 2013, and he enjoys drawing whilst engaged on serious alpine climbs, such as the Walker Spur on the Grand Jurasse and the Innominata ridge on the Italian side of Mont Blanc. Jon, who has a paintbrush clipped to his harness, is joining us from somewhere in Yorkshire. Over to you, Jon.
Hello. Thank you, Nick. Thanks for that introduction, and that last presentation takes some following. I mean, some people have said that Loppé worked in some very serious places too, and I've never seen the view off Mont Blanc, and I always seem to coincide being up there with a storm, so I've never got a drawing book out, always far too cold. So my first introduction, it's called Join the Hills 2, because the first one I did was far too long for this presentation, so I kind of thinned it down and decided to put this drawing of Stanage. I was selling some photographs that I'd done of Stanage one Sunday at the car park, and people weren't buying, so I got my book out, and I really enjoyed the kind of sinuous nature of Stanage going across into the distance. So the thing about it and what goes with it is to do with the people you meet. Drawing is quite a solitary thing. Your mates always don't like having to wait for you if you're doing a drawing, but if you go up on your own, it's fine. But if you're on a big serious route with somebody else, it can be a bit onerous for them. Fortunately, one of my partners likes his sleep, so he'd fall asleep if I was doing some drawing. So this is from the valley. Obviously, not a problem drawing in the valley. And it's a fairly recent drawing, acrylic, and it was a great route. Was this in 1980? I was talking to John Wilkinson, who lives in Chamonix, this afternoon, and he's unable to see this. He's just had an operation on his eye. John's an AC member. It was quite handy doing the Traverse of the Aiguilles as two ropes. We were able to help each other quite a lot with the abseiling, but that's a very, very fine route. Always interesting, always sort of wondering where to go. This is a large chalk drawing, done from some drawings that I did while I was camping, which you could in those days. It's illegal now. Camp up by the Lac Bleu. My youngest daughter, who lives in Australia, owns this one. It's about 1 metre high. It's on, I think this is on some kind of, it's not on sugar paper like a lot of them are, but it shows the Cayman and the Lepini and the southwest pillar of the Foo and the Rognon de Plan and part of the north face of the Plan. So when we did the route, we abseiled the wrong side of the Lepini. It's this very steep little knobble there on the left-hand side, and we bivouacked at the Col de Foo. I seem to remember having a good sleep there. So on the way across there, you go past some very fine views. There's no sky on this one. This is chalk on sugar paper. Another one, and really the morning light catches the North Deirdre of the Pane, which I've done 2 times. That's a very fine rock climb. In those days, we did all our rock climbing, or most of our rock climbing in mountaineering boots. We didn't take rock shoes. You had to learn to be able to climb at a good grade in big boots. So some people took rock boots, but it was possible. It was possible to climb at a decent grade in big boots, and people still do today. The original of this, I think, is in school paints on sugar paper. It's done based on a drawing. There's been 1 or 2 versions. So there's a photograph here. I told John this afternoon I was using his photograph. That this is me abseiling down the wrong side of the Lepini. Martin Harris went first, and he ended up in midair and managed to get in. But you can see, I think you just see that I've got one of those canvas jackets that you could buy in Chamonix in those days. So that was the spoils of selling a drawing. They were quite expensive. We didn't have much money really. So I treated myself to one of these blue canvas jackets with little loops and things underneath the arms for your gear. And I think I've got a homemade rucksack. But you can see the nature of it. There's a caiman and the crocodile and the Plan behind. And I think it's a particularly good photograph that John took there. And I think it sort of sums up the nature of that. It was very icy, was the north side. When we came down off the Cayman, we ended up abseiling into the middle of an 80-degree ice slope. And there was some gear there, but it had to be chopped out so that we could belay and make the next abseil. And they were like diagonal abseils, and we had to do them in crampons. And it was scarting about with that massive drop below you. It was quite interesting, really. Was that particular bit? Another view, obviously, the Cayman, the Foos on that, the Sizou, the Blatier, the Nantalons Glacier. As you can see back with the writing at the bottom there, I was at the swimming pool and Paul Nunn was swimming, as I was sometimes. So I can kind of remember my conversation with Paul at that particular time. It's probably about 1972, 73. He talked about Lattock and he talked a little bit about his work, and it wasn't until we had a memorial kind of bash for him in Sheffield that we really got to know the people that Paul worked with, and we had a great night with them. It kind of kept work and climbing apart up to that point, and the only person missing, of course, was Paul. There is a drawing, a Ruskin drawing from, I think there's a point not all that far from the swimming pool. I think there's a plaque there that Ruskin did a drawing of the Blatier from, and it never ceases to amaze me from the view from Chamonix. It's just staggering. It doesn't matter how many times you see it. Very, very inspiring. So I made some sales, yeah. René Desmais's wife bought one. Fred Harper got one. I think he was in charge of Glenmore Lodge at the time. Maurice Herzog, it was interesting shaking hands with him. And then I got pulled in off the streets to exhibit with the French mountain painters and got quite a good review in the Dauphiné. And then we spent quite a lot of time in the Barnache, and his children always. The French seem to appreciate artists a lot more than the English, so I've always had a much better reception. I wasn't actually working for a living, but we didn't have much money in those days. I believe at one stage the government let us take the princely sum of £25 out to go on holiday with. There must have been something going on with the currency. But this is near the Pitt's restaurant, which was Charlie. Charlie's grandmother or great grandmother had opened and run the Hotel d'Angleterre there. And so Charlie and I became really good friends, and he had these early lithographs. I think they were Link. William might know something about those. But of course they were hand-coloured, and a lot of Charlie's lithographs hadn't been coloured. So Charlie decided that he would let me loose on his valuable lithographs. He said, if anybody can do them, you can. So I ended up doing quite a lot in the bad weather and sometimes other times, and I got well looked after by Charlie's wife, who was a great cook, Ada. Charlie was always terrified of dying of cancer, and fortunately he didn't. Ada was quite a bit younger than him. I've been to see her a couple of times. So Charlie did take me down to Geneva. I did say they were upmarket. I think I had a different set of words for it there, but they told me I'd be famous when I died, to which I replied, I can't wait. So that was my brush with upmarket in Geneva. Right, through the tunnel. Yeah, I kind of discovered that other side. I mean, kind of looked down on it a bit. Chamonix sort of became a bit, I don't know, a bit like Blackpool. So we went somewhere a bit quieter. And John Barker, who was one of my climbing partners, he knew the campsite Monte Bianco in the Valveni, and so we went around there, and then we went back to Chamonix. But after that, I started going a lot more around into Italy and became very close friends. I'm just saying the noir is a favourite subject, but much easier to draw and paint. As I say, if you photograph the noir from the south, it blends in with Mont Blanc and the Aiguille Blanche and the Brouillard face, and sometimes it's quite hard to pick it out from what's going on behind, especially to do, depth of field issues. If there's a cloud behind it, it's fine, but with painting you can select, you can leave bits out and you can put bits in. I think I invented those clouds because when I did the Innominata, at that particular point it was clear, so I did a drawing of the mountain and put the clouds in afterwards, but 2 hours later we were in a raging storm, so I got all the clouds that you could wish for. Again, I sometimes work with binoculars, which does compress horizontal distance, but kind of makes for a more interesting design sometimes. This is a watercolour. I've used a bit of body colour on it just to suggest the onset of bad weather when the wind blows across from the west, from the Col de Seine, and if you see that kind of thing, you get off, unless of course you're Ben Tibbetts, who's probably quite happy to stay up there. But there's a Brouillard pillars up there on the left, and then the Fresnay up behind Mont Blanc. That's quite a popular picture. I've sold quite a few prints of that. It's quite a big watercolour, that. Again, you get up close to the mountain on the south side, and the rest of it falls behind it. This particular one belongs to a family who've got a really nice chalet in the Valveni, and I think they took it home where they live when they got it. I've done a few from up there. I really enjoyed doing the South Ridge of the Noir. It's something that really kind of sticks in your memory, does that kind of thing. So up at the Borelli Refuge, kind of walk up into the Fatul de Alamont with a drawing book, and just did a very kind of free drawing with a big brush. and really enjoyed doing that. Watercolour's not easy in the middle of the day in the Alps. The sun's above and dries very, very quickly. You can use it to your advantage, but then there's kind of shadows disappear as well. So the light seems to move very quickly, and I'm in admiration of Loppé. Quite interesting to see that a lot of his stuff was done early in the morning and late at night, which makes for a much more kind of interesting image. So there's a picture on the right of me doing a canvas at home outside. I think that was for an exhibition in Courmayeur. Again, looking at different kind of viewpoints. That's the sort of gap between is it the beginning of the South Ridge of the Noir and looking through into the Fresnay Glacier, and then the Brouillard pillars up behind, and Mont Blanc just shrouded in a bit of cloud blowing around. So just a few photographs. Renzo Pauline is the father of Matteo and Luca, and he owns a campsite in Valbeni, and they've been very friendly to me throughout the years that I've been going there. There's the old Eccles bivouac hut. Matteo, Renzo's son, has restored the new one fairly recently out of his own pocket. He got taken up there with all the equipment, and he rebuilt the inside of that. There's John Barker leaving the Valo following the Innominata. We got caught in a storm, and then we crawled over the top of Mont Blanc, but John was used to that. He'd done the Fresnay Pillar in about 1974, I think, and he'd been over in Thunder and Lightning before, so it wasn't a big thing to him, but it rattled around in the Valo. There was nobody else there, and the storm cleared in the morning from the top down, so there's a midi just coming out of the cloud, and John getting blown about on the way. That's the Jurassic below that from near the campsite, and there's Ian Blakely and I at the Borelli Refuge. So on to the Dream Ridge, 1997. We're celebrating John Barker's 60th birthday by being out there for a long time. I went out on my motorbike, and John was out there for at least a month with his wife, and the weather was a bit kind of grim really a lot of the time, so there was a lot of beer drunk. I did a lot of drawings of clouds, but then it did clear enough, and we got a couple of days, and John and I decided to go and climb all that ridge there. Matteo gave me a radio. We didn't have phones in those days, and that was a bit embarrassing with that sticking out the rucksack. But John likes his sleep, so we would quite often set off at midday when everybody's coming down. It didn't seem to faze him at all. He's climbing up through slush. Of course, when it comes evening, it starts to freeze. So we climbed over the Aiguille de Rochefort and the Dôme de Rochefort in the dark. I remember the sky going green as the sun set. It was incredible, and it was very, very cold. And I've got an old Leica camera, and my fingers froze so much that I couldn't change the film. It's a bit fiddly with a Leica. And then we went along the ice arête from the Dôme de Rochefort towards the Calotte, and then we just kind of ran out of steam. I cut a slot under the cornice, and John slept by my feet. We had a long slot under the cornice at Ice Axu in France for a belay. It was pretty cold. So we ended up in a storm again. Really good planning. We ended up in the Canzio bivouac hut, and we're going to call it a day there. We'd seen some lights on Point Young, and then just as this storm started and ice started falling off the rocks above the bivouac refuge, we heard this rustling outside, and this figure appeared, and it was Alberto Soncini, who John knew by reputation, and when we spoke to Matteo on his radio, Matteo knew him quite well. Alberto had been on K2 on the Chinese side, I think, and he was very pleased to find us there. Matteo had set off and climbed the courts and he'd done the what else he did? The Shroud, yeah, the Traverse of the Jurasses. He might have been at Mont Blanc as well. So he was very pleased to find John and I. We'd let lots of gas and food, and we were in there for 2.5 days, I think. I eventually we ran out of pots to pee into, so I had to break out of the window in the Canzio and bare my backside in the blizzard, and then dig the snow away so they could get out. And then we decided we were descending to France, being safer after the new snow had avalanched. And this is my only self-portrait. There's 3 of us descending the Glacier du Mont-Malais by the Périards. And we've been pretty friendly, and it turned into a bit of a race. Now, John was 60, I suppose. I was 49, and Alberto was a bit younger than us. And when we got on a Maille de Glace, we turned it into a proper race. And then we got to the Montembe's ladders. We only just managed to beat him up there to the train. When we got down to Chamonix on the train, Alberto had turned himself into some very smart. He looked like something off a Vogue magazine. And John Barker and I must have looked very, very rough. And he bought us a litre of beer each, and I got very drunk very quickly and fell off the pavement. The bus driver said, "That's not good in the mountains, is it?" And no. So he paid for us to go back into Italy. His car was in Argentière. Anyway, we made a friendship with Alberto, and he came to see us a couple of times through in the Val Beni. I thought I'd celebrate it by doing this drawing, this acrylic drawing. I did some sketches from near there. John Barker, along with Tut Braithwaite and Richard McCarty, I think they were the first 3 Englishmen to have done 2 routes on the north face of the Jurass. John had done the Walker Spur as his first route, and he climbed the Cross Spur in 1975 with my other climbing partner Ian. After that, we climbed as a 3 quite frequently, doing some fairly big routes as a 3. I thought it was a great number to climb with. And this is just a little drawing that I did while we were on the Walker. I think I might have showed it at the Alpine Club, I don't know. I've got an A5 sketchbook that I carry around in my rucksack and a tiny little sort of paint box. The sketchbook has saved my neck. A rock once went through 5 quite thick pages. Obviously, if the book hadn't been there, I think it might have done a bit of damage to my spine. So I've been quite thankful to have that book in my rucksack. This is my last drawing. Saved the Brigalia for kind of later on in life. I've been about 6 or 7 times. We used to camp at Bondo, but the campsite has been obliterated by the Shangalo falling down. I love drawing there. It's a nice place. It's very unspoilt. You can be in Switzerland if you want. You can be in Italy if you want. There's some good rock climbing in the valley if the weather's bad high up, and it's just a lot going for it, I think, that area, especially for kind of older people. While we're there, once I met, it might have been that particular date, I met John Temple, who's an AC member who has since died. He bought one of these drawings off me because he'd done his last big kind of alpine route, which was the North Ridge of the Badil. And it was John Temple who finally persuaded me to join the Alpine Club. Earlier, Ken Wilson had put a lot of pressure on me to join, and I was able to ring Ken up and tell him that I'd actually become a member, and he was really pleased. It was before Ken moved back from where he lived in the north down to London. So I had a good conversation with Ken about the AC. So that's just a very brief snapshot of what I've been up to for about 40 years. And thank you for listening. Over to Nick.
Thank you, John. Brilliant. Thank you. So last but not least this evening, we have Ben Tibbetts with us. Last year, Ben published Alpenglow, which is the result of an obsessive project involving 10,000 hours of climbing to reach all the highest summits in the Alps. It's a sumptuous book full of meticulous historical research, inspiring photography, intricate and beautiful drawings, and writing that captures the essence of each route. Ben is joining us from Chamonix to talk about it. Over to you, Ben.
Yeah, so I'll just precise. It wasn't 10,000 hours climbing. Is 10,000 hours of work in total. And I guess that's what I'll touch on here, is give a bit of background aspects to the Alpenglow project, and where a lot of the time actually went was, well, obviously research and writing and editing and all that kind of stuff. But as well as the expeditions, routes, whatever I describe in the text and photograph, there's also everything that went around that to get like the landscape images and the drawings and this and the other. Into some of the geekier aspects of image making that I don't discuss at all in the book, because the book would be even longer if I had. So I'm going to look at the mechanics of how we got where we did to get the right image at the right time of day or the right season. And Jon teed me up rather nicely, actually, saying how the Poutre Noir is often invisible against the rest of the mountains. And I didn't know he was going to say that, but it's perfect. So this is an image from Testa delle Coni, which is high above Courmayeur. It's the east face of Mont Blanc. And this is actually, it's already like the third time I'd been up here. I had this image in mind of the east face of Mont Blanc at sunrise. And first two times we woke to what we'll call a grey rise, when actually there's clouds in the east and you just don't get anything and you get no photos. And it's already, it's like an hour and a bit drive and a 5-hour hike to get up to this spot for sunrise. So it's already a fairly considerable investment of time. So from this location, depending on what time of year you're at, so obviously the sun in the middle of winter rises in the southeast, and then on the summer solstice, it rises in the northeast. And so this image was in October, and you can kind of see that the whole east face looks pretty much flat, which is because the sun's rising directly behind me. And I knew it'd do this, but it's a perfect moment anyway, but it wasn't quite the image I wanted. So if we move to the next image, what we'll see is at a different time of year. So this is August, exactly the same time, like 6 to 10 minutes after sunrise. Instead of the sun rising directly behind me, the sun's rising off to my right, as in it's rising slightly further in the north, over the Col de Valferre. And when I'm at an oblique angle, the sun isn't directly behind me, you can see that this casts the whole face of Mont Blanc into relief. You can see the form of the Poutre Ridge. And that was what I was after, because as beautiful as the first image is, I also wanted to make the book kind of useful for people to work out where they're actually going in the mountains. And some of the landscape images, I chose one over another, so it'd actually be a useful resource. So the first time that I got the sunrise that you saw before, it wasn't useless, because I also got where the sun was directly behind me, but off to my right, the next image, you see the Grand Jurasse, obviously is at a different angle between me and the sun, the subject. And so at the same time that the Mont Blanc face looked totally flat because the sun was behind me, in October, I got this image of the Grand Jurasse with the sun obliquely across the face, which is great. So that's kind of intro into, this was a reasonably easy place to get to. It's just a 5-hour hike. Where it became, I needed to be more precise was getting to mountains that are really a long way away, to get images that I didn't want to try and do 5 times to get the right image. So if we move on to the next image, so the same year I got these ones. I was over in Grindelwald, bivouacking up opposite the Eiger Monk Jungfrau, trying to get photos of their north face at sunset. And I got this one of the Schreckhorn, which I was reasonably happy with. You know, it's a nice enough image, and the form's fine, but it gave me this sense that I needed something that gave more of a holistic view of what the Schreckhorn is. This, you know, it just looks like any other slightly pointy mountain. And so looking through FatMap and Google Earth and Swiss Map and a whole load of other applications for photographers, I worked out where I wanted to be, or in a kind of the right time of year. I really like mountains with a lot of snow on them because it helps kind of describe the relief. It also helps the sunrise or sunset light to kind of reflect and give this kind of glowing effect. So I set out with Valentin and my friend Tom Coney an expedition just to get one image. This wasn't the image, but an expedition that was pretty much as long as any of the other ones that I described in the book, but this was just to get one image, and it doesn't even get described. You just get the photo. So we set out from Fiesche, went all the way up the Concordia Glacier, over the Grunhornlucke, I think, and then up past the Finsteraarhorn-hut. That's Finsteraarhorn in the background. We're up heading towards the Fiescherhorn, and between the two 4000, which are the Grosser and Hinter Fiescherhorn, there's a big kind of plateau there, and then off the northeast there's this Kleines Fiescherhorn, the Ochs, which is a pretty well unknown peak. I don't know anyone else who's climbed it. Beautiful, beautiful summit, but obviously it's next to two 4000ers, so nobody goes there. But this is where I decided that I wanted to get this photo from, and it's really not a very convenient place. Obviously, the Schreckhorn's off just to my northeast, and I'm trying to photograph the westerly side, so it's going to be a sunset. And being on a peak that's 3,895 meters at sunset is obviously a bit of a constraint of itself. So the reason I wanted the image from there is because it was much easier actually just to get to the Fiescherhorns and shoot from them, but then the Kleine Fiescherhorn is in the way. So I wanted this big kind of precipice in front of me that allowed me to photograph the whole of the Schreckhorn and Lauter west face. So what we eventually got was the sheer scale of this face, and the Schreckhorn hut's sort of just out of sight down below here. This needed to be done after at a particular point in the year, because obviously to my west and to the west of the Schreckhorn, you've got a load of higher peaks. So you've got everything from the Finsteraarhorn, which is obviously much higher, and then the Monk and the Jungfrau and the Fiescherhorn. They'd all block the light at sunset. So I needed this to be at the point where the sun starts to set quite far in north of due west. So if you move to the next slide, you can see how geeky we get to work out when we need to do these photos. And there's often really quite short periods of time when the sun, so here you can see that the big orange line is where the sun is setting, and where I am is the little red circle, the Kleine Fächerhorn, and this is the kind of perfect angle between me, the subject, and the sunset, that the sun casts relief across the ridges on the west face, and also that the sun isn't blocked by the Jungfrau or the Monk or the Eiger, but is clear setting to the north. And so if we see in the next photo, we get the really end of sunset light all the way down the mountain, because the sun's setting sort of somewhere north of the Bernese Alps. So in the next image, we get a sense of quite what it took to actually get there, to be then on the summit of this Ochs, the Kleine Fächerhorn, at sunset. So this massive journey just to get there. And then we're on the summit at 9 in the evening or whatever. The Finsteraarhorn hut was full. The only space we could find was the Oberaarjoch-Hütte. So we had to descend the whole of the Fischer Glacier in the dark, then climb back up the Oberaarjoch hut in the dark. Try not to wake up the Guardian, because they don't like that. And then the next morning, we actually only got about 3 hours sleep. I then headed up to the Schürzehorn to get a sunrise photo of the Lauterhaarhorn, and then we headed all the way back out down the Fischer Glacier. So in less than 24 hours, we did 3,500 meters climbing and 50 kilometers, and that was just to get basically one photo. I got a few others on the side, but so you can see some of the detail required logistically to get some of the landscape photos. When it comes to the drawings, the beauty of drawings is actually unlike Loppé or Mr. Colton. I do sketches out on the hill, but for the most part, my finished drawings I do in the studio. And I'll get a photo. So here I'm with Liv Santos and Marco, and Valentine's somewhere probably ahead of us. We're on the Finsteraarhorn, and looking over to the Schreckhorn and Lauterhaarhorn again. And if we move to the next photo, so the mountain up in the top right corner here, I've got a photo of that. And so here we're in very harsh light conditions, and middle of the day landscape photography doesn't really do it for me. I'm not gonna publish a picture that looks like this. It's all kind of blue and grey and white, and there's not really any warmth to it. But what a photo like this is useful for is picking out the details, and is useful for me for working for a drawing. So if we move on to the next image, you can see that it picks out all the details that I then want to draw in to allow the topo to be reasonably clear. Obviously, it'd be even clearer if I just drew it on top of the photograph. But I like drawing, so I end up putting the drawings in. So I'll give it a little bit of a overview of how I make the drawings. So in the next photo, there's actually really not a whole lot to say. I sit down and draw. Obviously, I work from photos very directly. The drawings, I work through a magnifying glass with a selection of pencils, from like normal wood and graphite pencils, from whatever 5H down to about 2B. A lot of the time though, I use a little mechanical pencil. Anyway, you're getting a little bit geeky here. Yeah, I just look up and down, magnifying glass, looking up at the image, looking down, looking up, looking down. It's kind of as simple as it looks. So the images are very small, which is a function really of the space I have to work with, and also the time I have to work with. I like the end product being semi-photorealistic. There's something really attractive about the end product when it's hung on a wall. The kind of illusion of being a photograph draws you in, but then a photograph, you look at it for a few seconds and you're like, oh, it's nice, great. Whereas the actual texture and mark making and the obvious patience that goes into it really draws the viewer into these. And they already take between 20, 40, sometimes 60 hours each to do these ones, which are like about the size of a postcard. So that's why I don't do them any bigger, because I don't have the time or patience. So if we move next, we've got a little time lapse, which just shows how I build up the structure of the drawing. I sort of work with the lightest shades. I just sort of stencil in slightly the basic forms, get everything in the right place, and then build up the tonality, working across the image. Yeah, so it's a very short time lapse. Just gives you an idea how the images come about. And so, yeah, moving on to just the next image. You could see the scale before me working over the image. This one, you can see a pencil next to a drawing gives a kind of a rather more graphic illustration of quite how small these are, and why I'm working through a magnifying glass. So that's finishing with the drawing. I know we've all massively overrun how long we're meant to speak. I'm just going to finish off with, so we've looked at how I get some of the landscape images, we've looked at how I work the drawings out, and here we'll just look at some of the action images, and again, the same sort of light, sunrise, sunset, time of year, precisions of why and when I go and do a certain route. So the Alpenglow, the 4000s wasn't quite enough, so I'm now working on a book on the 3000s, a selection of the finest routes on the 3,000 meter peaks, of which there are almost innumerable. So it's probably going to take me to retirement. So here, just this February, did the southwest ridge of the Grand Cornier, and the timing on this had to be really precise to within like a couple of weeks. There's other times I could have done it, but I wanted to do it in winter, just because I'm a bit perverse, and a rocky ridge in winter with all the snow I thought would look really nice. But obviously you've got the Mont Blanc right to the south of it, which is enormous, and it's a lot lower. And so in the middle of December, for instance, the sun would be blocked at sunrise by the Mont Blanc. So here you can see the yellow line going out right. This was basically the week that I decided I wanted to do it. The sun was rising just to the north of the Mont Blanc and just to the south of the Obergabelhorn. And so we can see in the next image, we set off well before sunrise from the bivouac hut at the Col de Mont Blanc, and the light is just appearing. So you've got the Mont Blanc kind of filling most of the visual field, and obviously if the sun had risen behind that, for the kind of photos I like to get, which are the kind of key moment is before the sun rises, and then until about 30 minutes after the sun rises. And then for me, it's that's the moment that I need to get, is this sort of like the first 10 minutes after sunrise, the most epic light of the day. And so I really wanted, obviously just above the horizon, the sun's going through a lot of atmosphere, which is why it's very colorful. And as soon as it goes 3, 4, 10, 15 degrees above the horizon, it gets the light gets colder and colder and bluer and less attractive. So if we move to the next image, so the sun's going to rise just to the right of the Obergabelhorn and really like low on the horizon compared with me, which means it's going to be really magnificent color. And this was kind of the image that I dreamt of getting. And if I hadn't gone in the right week of the year, then the sun wouldn't have risen. It would have risen either behind the Dent Blanche, in which point there would be no sun at all, or behind the Obergabelhorn, in which case it would have been higher above the horizon before it hit us, and the light would have been colder. Yeah, it's very geeky, I know. So in the next image, we can just see already. So the first image, the light's really kind of pinky. It's got that very, very first hue of sunrise. And then in this next image, where we see exactly where the sun has risen, already it's a few degrees above the horizon. You can see behind Valentine, you can see where I got that photo before, just sort of a few hundred meters behind her on the ridge. But already we're like 10 minutes later or something, and the light is already less colorful. Still pretty good for the first half hour. And this is the time of the day basically that all the action happens, and Valentine and I are just like racing along, and I'm like, stop, okay, I'll come towards me, bang, and you get a photo and then move on. And I race the next bit, and I'm looking forwards, looking backwards. Is that a good shot? And I probably noticed I love getting shots with the sun in the background, and I use certain lenses that when you stop them down to like f/16, they give this nice sun star. And then really quite quickly the show's over. So move on to just the last image of my presentation. And this is probably only 45 minutes after sunrise. But for me already the light's way beyond perfect. Maybe it's an hour before, like the golden hour really isn't an hour. The golden hour is like really short. And though, you know, still get some really interesting images, for me, it's all about those moments just before and after sunrise. And that's all I've got to say. So thank you everyone for your patience, and I'll hand you back to Nick.
Thank you, Ben. That's a wonderful book. It's currently underneath my laptop, so it's serving a good purpose. So thanks very much to William, Jon, and Ben. If you've got a question for any of our speakers, do switch on your video, go with your mouse to the bottom of your screen, click on participants, and at the bottom of that screen, you'll see the option to raise a hand. And if you're on YouTube, you can type a question into the chat there, and Nigel will pass those across. Good, so let's have a look. So whilst we're waiting for those to come in, actually, I'll just kick off with a question for William. I'm a big fan of Loppé, and I'm just curious. I mean, you talked about what a good guy he was, and I just wondering what, you know, he's obviously clearly a really nice chap to have dinner with. Perhaps you could comment on that, and also I just wanted to ask you perhaps whether you could say a little bit more about your book as well.
Thank you. The reason I mentioned that he was a good guy, he had a very unhappy childhood, and his early years were, until about 16 or 17, he was incredibly sickly, and he was shunted from one city to another because his father was in the army, and his parents rather gave up with him. And the similarities with Leslie Stephen, who was also very sickly, and a lot of people thought he wouldn't become anyone. And I think that Loppé he wasn't particularly socially accomplished or didn't come from a great French family. He really fell in with this group in the Alpine Club. And I maintain that he didn't speak particularly good English. And I maintain that one of the themes of what I write about is that his sheer Gallic humour and his toughness, he was extremely tough and he could put up with anything. And I think that people found him fascinating because he would come to London and spend 3 or 4 months. And I think he probably Baron strangled a few people. He was constantly, his diaries talk about him being in the opera and dining he was in the Ritz and he had a lovely time. But I think he just had an infectious character. And he was very anti-Paris, which was a theme that was his undoing, which I mentioned he was forgotten about because he didn't show at the salons in Paris until the 1880s, and which meant it was suicide for him as an artist because France was so centralized. So he was an Anglophile and he didn't really have any airs and graces, but he felt very at home in the Alpine Club and was very loyal to them. And so when you look at the picture in the lecture room at the Alpine Club, I think you have to also look at the warmth of the colours as the warmth of the friendship and goodwill towards the club. So, and my book is really a story, but it's, here it is. If anyone, on the back is the undoing of Loppé, and on the front is it's 200 pages. It has 125 illustrations. It's a historical study. It puts him in the context. It discusses the Second Empire, but it's really a story of Loppé knew plenty of unhappiness in his life. His first wife died, and then he married James Eccles' sister, who was a prominent Alpine Club photographer. And it was the fact that he came to England so often. I mean, he went to the Isle of Skye 14 times in his life. He never sat still. And he was, to sum it up, there was a beautiful, there's a wonderful story of the time by Baudelaire, the French poet, which talks about modernité. And Loppé was a man of his time. He was the most contemporary person you would have met. He adored trains and engineering and the Eiffel Tower. He even took that photograph because he watched the Eiffel Tower being built. So it's a story of a man who lived in a fascinating period, but unfortunately a period which was just too busy for a guy like him to have swum above the surface. So that, I hope, answers your question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks, William. So, yeah, a few questions coming in. Alex Metcalf, do you want to go ahead, Alex?
I do. First of all, guys, thanks for a great presentation. I've got a new favourite artist in Loppé now. I've even changed my background to him. So I had a question for Ben. Ben, what was your default settings when out on a ridge, say just 10 minutes after dawn? What do you have your camera set to and dialed just before you head off?
I'm fiddling with them non-stop. So you set off in the dark and it's manual, and then I like a really high ISO, and then I'm gradually lowering the ISO as it gets closer to dawn, sunrise, and then sometime before sunrise I'll switch it to aperture mode. I'll put in aperture priority because if I'm shooting into the sun, I'll want to be controlling that, and I've got too much to think about to be fully in manual. But yeah, basically I'm changing it the whole time. But before dawn, I'm in fully manual of everything, and I'm reviewing like every few shots to check that the balance is right. And then after sunrise, I'll use like aperture priority.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Ken, do you want to go ahead? Ken Findlay?
Yep, thank you. Thanks for the great evening, fantastic speakers. If I could just say to Ben, wonderful book, I love your book. Could I ask, what was the most difficult shot that you had to take on any of the mountains in the book?
Oh wow, thank you. The most difficult shot. Wow, that's quite a question. Wow. Well, probably actually the one that I talk about on getting the Schreckhorn and Lauter Ahorn. Of single images, that was probably the most effort I went to get one single image. I got obviously others at the same time, and it doesn't really show very well on the screen, but the whole thing is a big panorama in the end. But yeah, that's probably, obviously the more dramatic ones where any photo along the Puterais Integral is pretty hard to get, and it was a long time ago, and I had a pretty small camera because we were dashing pretty quickly, so those were hard to get. But of the single images, probably, it's not the best shot by any means, but that one of the Schreckhorn, that took a lot of doing. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. John, I think I'm right. You wanted to ask a question, didn't you?
Yes.
Just a comment, really, as much as anything.
Oh, that John.
Painting myself, as a painter myself, I find that if you're trying to draw in or paint in plein air, the mountain never stays the same for 2 minutes. It's always changing. You're looking at something and thinking, there's something wrong there, and then the light changes and you suddenly realize that there's a gap in the ridge that you couldn't see before, or this sort of thing happens all the time. Well, the theme that runs through all of this lecture that strikes a chord with me is that artists or photographers are the worst people you ever want to climb with, because they're always stopping and wanting to draw something or take a photograph.
Thanks, John. Jon Coulton, do you want to go ahead? I think you had a question too, didn't you, as well?
Yeah, I was going to ask William, are there any Loppés around today? Any relatives?
Yes, there are. There are. His great-grandson lives down in the hometown where the family came from, in Mont Blanc. And his father was the mayor of Chamonix back during the war. And during the Second World War is an amazing story. His father had his own stories to tell. But yes, there are descendants of Loppé. And his great-great-great-grandson is actually called Gabriel as well. But they're very proud of him. And at the moment, in the Dauphiné, today's edition, yesterday's edition, there's a wonderful article about an exhibition that's just opened in Grenoble, which features a big Loppé. So there's a big campaign to get him better known, and the family are very loyal to him. Yeah.
Thank you.
Robin Campbell, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, if I may. For William, you hear me, William?
Yes.
Yeah, I wondered about Ruskin. They must have been in Chamonix on several occasions at the same time, also in London, I dare say. Was there any interaction at all between Loppé and Ruskin?
Robin, to answer your question, there wasn't. And Loppé was allergic to people like Turner and Ruskin. He looked at paintings by Calam in the Neuchâtel Museum, and he wrote in his diary he thought they were awful. And Loppé was not a particularly emotional or romantic soul.
Right.
And so he didn't sort of associate with those people, and he felt a bit of an imposter when it came to art history. He went to the Louvre and he looked at pictures, but he didn't have any comment on art of his time, which is a mystery, because I know he looked at paintings, but and I think Ruskin would have absolutely loathed someone like Loppé, because it would have broken every tenet that someone like Ruskin had, that you couldn't possibly climb and paint in a mountain. And, because a lot of those things, they're not actually, Ruskin was a theory man, and I don't think he climbed anything. He was an extraordinarily academically accomplished scholar, but he didn't, it's interesting. It's a very good question. I cannot see how there was any interaction, and there's no record of it. So.
Well, it seems to be, with the benefit of hindsight, that we can see there two of the real masters of Alpine painting. One in oil, Loppé, one in watercolor, Ruskin.
Yeah.
And they were contemporaries, really.
Yeah.
And they never commented on each other's work or seemed to have any cognizance of it. That's your reading, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I think,
extraordinary.
Robin, to answer that bit of it, that Loppé sold his paintings to Alpine Club members, and he was very proud of the fact that in his pocketbook he had lists of who bought his pictures, and it was invariably friends that he climbed with. And I think he felt that was recognition enough, because his parents didn't even want him to be an artist, so it was very difficult. And I think he would have been intimidated.
If I can interrupt, this is hardly a point of difference. I mean, Ruskin hardly sold a picture. He never bothered to exhibit them. He gave them away occasionally. But this is not a point of difference between them. It's a point of similarity.
Yep, I agree.
Good stuff. Thank you, Robin. Thanks for that. There's just one more question, I think, and that's from Hewell. Do you want to go ahead, Hewell?
Point really, but it's like, say, brilliant event and brilliant three speakers. But I'd like to say hello to William in particular. William, you've shown Loppé pictures, which I've never seen before at all. And I'm fascinated by what you collected from around the different parts of the world. I shall go back to your book and study it much more carefully now. But thank you very much for a splendid lecture. And thank you for everybody, for everything. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I can see a few comments coming in on YouTube. There's a nice comment from Phil Children saying 3 fantastic presentations. I'll second that. It's been a real pleasure, I must say, working on this. Actually, there's one more question coming in from Dennis Gray. Dennis, do you want to go ahead?
Well, the observation is that tonight is really marvellous to show how far the Alpine Club's come. Because in the 1970s, we had to do a big job to persuade the committee and everybody to take the pictures, the paintings, the photographs seriously. And so Leo Gollins and I were invited to do some kind of an inventory. And believe it or not, in the basement of South Audley Street, there was just a pile of paintings. There was Compton's, there was Ruskin's, there was Lopez, there was Godwin's, there was Collingwood's. They were just sat there in a wet, damp basement. And Livia wrote a very, very good piece of work for the committee. I picked up a box of slides and were by cellar, and they were just sat in a damp basement. And so from then on, she wrote a very good piece to the committee. Things began to be taken seriously. But a question for William. I hadn't realized about Lopez till he started beating the drum. And the painter that I always supported and always have thought the best mountain painter from Britain was E.T. Compton. Did Compton and Lopez ever meet, or did Lopez have any idea or look at Compton?
That's an excellent question, because in a way, Compton is technically a finer artist than Loppé, and Compton was, in my opinion, a better watercolorist than an oil painter. His watercolors are as good as anybody, and Jon has made his life. I can't believe Jon does watercolors in the mountains because they're so incredibly difficult, and talking about that changing of atmosphere. But Compton was an extremely accomplished painter. But Compton was a loner. You know, he'd left England when he was 16, and he lived in Bavaria. He never came back to England. He did exhibit at the Alpine Club. There are records of Compton showing alongside Loppé. There's no record of them having met, and they must have met at some point in the 1880s. But Loppé was older than him. Compton wasn't born until 1847. I think that Compton climbed hundreds of peaks that he didn't even record, and all in the Dolomites and the Austrian Alps. And he climbed with a few select group of people, and he kept himself to himself. And it's a shame that we don't know more interaction. But again, it goes back to the fact that Compton was a highly accomplished. He had a background as an engraver and an illustrator. He came from a family of artists. So when you look at his watercolors, the pigments he used and everything, he was a much, much more accomplished painter. But I think that to answer it probably the best way, why does everyone like Loppé? probably most of all me, is that he was a purveyor of memories. And I think that when you look at Compton, you see science and geology. And I look at Loppé's pictures and I feel memories and I feel a yearning to go back climbing. And that's potentially where the difference is.
Yes, well, Compton was a very, very outstanding climber himself. He did over 300 routes, yeah. And some of them were first ascents, like the first ascent of the Brenta, the Guglia Brenta, and in the Mont Blanc range, he did some very big first ascents, and he climbed with some of the top German climbers like Burscheller and Blodig. I think Blodig was the first person to do all the 4,000-meter peaks.
Yeah.
So, but he was in a very, very keen group of alpinists and so forth. But his paintings, to me, are really outstanding. And I was won over to them by when Ian Howell and I were invited to give a lecture at the Alpenbayern House in Innsbruck. And they had an exhibition on, this was in 1965, of Compton's paintings. So that was very impressive.
I think to answer your, I was lucky enough to go and visit Reinhold Messner in his relatively new museum, and our meeting was going quite well. And I pulled out a photograph of a Loppé I had for sale, and I said to him, "You seem to not really like this painter," and I got the kind of back end of his anger. So he was not happy. He said, "I never said I had an opinion," and he's got lots and lots of Comptons. So. And I said, well, I think it'd be a good idea to own one. Anyway, I was on the cable car quite quickly.
Well, thank you very much anyhow for that. Thank you.
So I think Compton did visit Wales at one point, just one summer.
You did, John, yeah.
Yes. So you must have travelled through England at that point.
Yeah, no, he did. But he never settled in England again.
No. His home was in
Munich. He lived in Munich.
Just down the road from Munich, that's right. Yeah.
He was born in Stoke Newington.
Good stuff. Well, Stoke Newington brings us to a close. I think that's it. Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much to William, Ben and John. Tonight we've seen some wonderful art from past and present artists of the Alpine Club. So if you'd like to see further art from the collection, then we now have about 80 images from the Alpine Club available at artuk.org. That's artuk.org. So if you'd like one of those Loppé paintings above your mantelpiece, for example, then you can order your own print. And for that, the Alpine Club receives a payment. Next week's Alpine ClubCast number 12 is the first in a double bill entitled The Six Great North Faces. The Rucksack Club and Alpine Club, two of Britain's oldest mountaineering clubs, combine over 2 episodes to take you up the classic tick list of 6 great North Faces of the Alps, with accounts from members of each club. Next week, we're hosted by the Rucksack Club, and we'll start with the trilogy of the Matterhorn, Eiger and Grand Jurasse, with speakers Andy Kirkpatrick, Martin Cooper, Nick Wallace, and Bill Deacon and Cess Rhodes. Do have a look at the Alpine Club Library YouTube page, where you can watch, like, and share all the previous Alpine Clubcasts. Thanks all for joining us. Keep safe, keep active, and keep alert. Please unmute yourself now so we can applaud tonight's speakers. And good night from London.